There are a few franchises or IPs that have stuck with me as long as Godzilla. I actually can't remember exactly when I saw my first film, but I do vaguely remember staring at the cover art for Godzilla King of the Monsters and Terror of Mechagodzilla that were part of a VHS box set that I owned when I was little. Godzilla has been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. I grew up mainly with the Showa era films. Those are the old school classic films from the 50s all the way through the 70s. I also had Godzilla vs. Biollante on VHS, along with Godzilla 2000 and the infamous Godzilla 1998 that starred Matthew Broderick. In the early 2000s, for one of my birthdays, my parents got me a brand new GameCube. It was a pretty big deal because up to that point, I'd only played a GameCube once at a friend's house and seen some pictures in Nintendo Power magazines. The first game my parents got me was Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee. I didn't even know this game existed up to that point, but boy did I love it. Me and my brothers played the crap out of that game, and its sequel, Godzilla Save the Earth, on PlayStation 2. Whenever my parents would take us to the park, or anywhere really, I used to stomp around and pretend that I was Godzilla. I had the whole look down pretty good. I'd walk around like Godzilla, I'd mimic his iconic roar, and I'd even pretend I was shooting atomic breath out of my mouth. Suffice to say, I really love Godzilla. But what exactly is it about the franchise that keeps me coming back to it? Why did I commit myself to watching every single movie in the franchise? And why am I a bigger fan now than I ever was as a kid? My name's Firewolf, and this is why I love Godzilla. First, we have to take a step back and cover a little bit of the history of Godzilla and how this 70-year-old franchise got started in the first place. The year is 1954, World War II had just ended only 9 years earlier, and it was fresh in the minds of everyone around the world, especially Japan, the country that, to this day, remains the only direct victim of atomic weaponry. After a massive tragedy such as a world war, there becomes a need to reflect and explore themes of tragedy within works of art, such as film. However, as a part of the restriction placed on Japan after the war by the US, Japan was not allowed to create movies depicting war. That's when the film director Ishiro Honda came up with the idea to create a monster movie that would symbolically represent war and atomic weapons without explicitly showing them on screen. Ishiro Honda got his inspiration for creating the monster film from the original 1933 King Kong film, as well as the 1953 film The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, where a giant radioactive dinosaur comes up from the sea and destroys a city. Sound familiar? Another thing also served as inspiration for the creation of Godzilla, a real-world event known as the 1954 Lucky Dragon incident, where Japanese fishermen were exposed to lethal levels of radiation from nuclear fallout that was created as a result of the first testing of the hydrogen bomb by the US off the coast of Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific. Several of the crew members later died from the radiation sickness, and the fish that the fishermen had caught that were also exposed to radiation were actually sold on the market, causing a widespread panic in Japan over irradiated food. Just goes to show the massive unforeseen consequences of even testing a nuclear weapon, let alone using it to bomb hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. But I digress. Godzilla, or Gojira as it's known in Japan, would release in theaters on October 27, 1954, to shock, wow, and terrify audiences. The film would receive an English dubbed version, retitled Godzilla King of the Monsters, which would be released in April of 1956, just 2 years later. This version of the film would become infamous for its edits, inclusion of additional American actors, and an overall dumbing down and censoring of the original tone of the film. The original Godzilla is a gritty, somber, and tragic movie. It really was an allegory for humanity's capacity for self-destruction. Godzilla is a creature born out of the testing of nuclear weapons, and even the weapon used to ultimately defeat Godzilla has the ability to end all life on the planet if used in the wrong way, the oxygen destroyer. Godzilla is a reflection of the double-edged nature of technological progress and of science, as well as a reflection on the horrors of nuclear weapons and war. It is a much more serious and depressing film when compared to the whimsical, often cheesy and low-budget movies that the series would become widely known for. The original 1954 Gojira created an entire new genre within the Japanese cinema, known as kaiju or giant monster genre. It is without a doubt one of the most influential and iconic movies in cinema history, and should be watched by anyone regardless of their interest in the rest of the series. Godzilla would quickly receive a sequel just 1 year later, titled Godzilla Raids Again. The rushed nature of the movie resulted in a pretty noticeable downgrade in both quality and tone. While the movie still attempted to have a serious tone, this time using Godzilla and a new monster known as Anguirus to represent the then current Cold War between Russia and America. The questionable quality of the movie results in some unintentional humor. It was the next film in the series that would fully embrace Godzilla not as a serious allegory for nuclear war and the folly of man, but as a cheesy B-movie action hero. And that movie was the now cult classic King Kong vs. Godzilla, released in 1962. This was the first movie in the franchise to be fully colored, and it was also the first movie to be intentionally funny. King Kong vs. Godzilla is a self-aware movie that pokes fun at capitalist greed and cinema's need for creating bigger and bigger spectacle. It's a charming and goofy movie that knows how to have fun and not take itself too seriously. King Kong vs. Godzilla was the birthplace of the silly guy in a rubber suit monster movie that most people associate with Godzilla today. It's this dichotomy between Godzilla being an allegory for the horror of war and nuclear weapons, and also being a silly monster movie for children, that I love so much about Godzilla as a whole. Godzilla is not just one thing. He can be made to fill many shoes, and is one of the most versatile characters in all of cinema. Need to make a movie reflecting on the tragedy of the Fukushima disaster? Godzilla. Need to make a movie about being bullied as a child? Godzilla. Need to make a movie about human pollution? Godzilla. Need to make a movie about the dangers of nuclear weapons? Godzilla. He really can be made to be anything, and I think that's part of the reason that the franchise has been able to endure for so long. If Godzilla was just one thing, then he would have become irrelevant a long time ago. But Godzilla's ability to adapt to the times and to take on new current issues, like in the 2016 Shin Godzilla, where he was used to represent the Fukushima disaster, where a tsunami resulted in the nuclear meltdown at Fukushima nuclear power plant, means that he can stay relevant and important seemingly indefinitely. The series would continue after King Kong vs. Godzilla for another 12 movies, making 15 movies in the original series in total. This original series would come to be known as the Showa era by fans, and stretches from 1954 all the way to 1975. The franchise would then lay dormant for nearly a decade until 1984. Audiences would finally get to see the Big G on screen once again, with the release of The Return of Godzilla, or just Godzilla 1985 as it's known by some. 1985 being the year that the English dubbed version of the movie was released in America. It was another shameless re-edit that dumbed down the plot for the American audience and edited in scenes of Raymond Burr into various scenes in the movie for seemingly no reason, just like what was done for the original Godzilla movie. The reason for the Godzilla franchise being put on ice at the end of the 70s was mostly due to a lack of public interest and burnout. Terror of Mechagodzilla, the last movie to hit theaters before the series would go on a 9-year hiatus, was the least attended Godzilla movie ever up to that point, and actually it remains the least attended movie in the franchise to this day, which sucks because it's actually one of the best movies of the Showa era films. I just love the way that Godzilla is introduced in this movie. It's like the start of a sumo wrestler match. I love the Showa era movies because their low budget and cheap effects actually make the movie incredibly charming and fun to watch. They're always good for a laugh, or as an easy to watch comfort movie to put on in the background. We also get some of the most goofy and iconic moments in the whole franchise, as the dropkick scene, the victory dance, and Godzilla flying through the air. There's definitely a lot of nostalgia for me here too. Like I said earlier, most of the Godzilla movies I saw as a kid were from the Showa era. I had Godzilla King of the Monsters, Terror of Mechagodzilla, Godzilla's Revenge, Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, also known as Invasion of Astro Monster, Mothra vs. Godzilla, Godzilla vs. Megalon, and Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, also known as Ebra Horror of the Deep. I watched these movies so much that the sleeves of the VHS tape started falling apart. I also purposely tore off the tops of the sleeves for some reason. I have no idea why I did this, and I'm still angry with myself 20 years later. I was a pretty stupid kid back then, so I guess nothing's changed much. Anyway, the Showa era introduced us to some of the most iconic monsters in the Godzilla franchise, like Mothra, Rodan, King Ghidorah, and Mechagodzilla, and, Jet Jaguar.
Jet Jaguar, Jet Jaguar, Yatta Jaguar.
Well, not all the monsters were created equal, I suppose. After the Showa era came the Heisei era of Godzilla movies, which lasted from 1984 to 1995, starting with The Return of Godzilla and ending with Godzilla vs. Destroya. These movies were generally higher budget and slightly less goofy compared to their Showa era counterparts. Godzilla was also more of an anti-hero in these movies instead of the straight-up good guy, like in many of the Showa era movies. The special effects were really ramped up for these movies, and it leads to some pretty awesome fight scenes and action stuff. The Heisei era is beloved by many fans, including myself. It gave us probably the most iconic look for Godzilla that people still associate with the character to this day, despite the Heisei movies being lesser known by the general public. Most of the movies in the Heisei era are remakes of the previous films, but we did get some original stuff too, like Godzilla vs. Biollante and Godzilla vs. Destroya, which are considered to be some of the best movies in the franchise by many fans. Like I mentioned earlier, the only Heisei movie I owned as a kid was Godzilla vs. Biollante, and I loved it. It was so much more gritty and badass compared to the more silly-toned Showa era movies that I was used to. Not to say that the Showa era movies are bad, quite the opposite actually, but there's something just super cool about the Heisei movies. It wasn't until I decided to watch all the movies in the franchise that I finally got to experience all the Heisei era movies, and I'm glad I did. The Heisei movies are some of the best in the entire franchise. The practical effects, the suits, the fight scenes, everything just looks so good. And it was all building up to the final movie that would end the Godzilla franchise once and for all. Well, at least that was the plan. In 1998, a little movie with the title of Just Godzilla, starring Matthew Broderick, would release in American theaters and theaters all around the world to very mixed reviews. Casual audiences that didn't know much about Godzilla other than the namesake enjoyed the movie, but Godzilla fans, on the other hand, well, let's just say they weren't too happy about it. Personally, I enjoyed the movie as a kid. I accepted that it was just a different interpretation of the monster. The thing that always really bothered me about the movie is just how terrible the acting was, and how annoying and unlikable the human characters are. And that would be a reoccurring problem in the Godzilla series for many more years to come. I do, however, see the point that people are making about Godzilla 1998. It's definitely not a Godzilla movie, in the sense that it didn't do much to stay true to the source material. Godzilla in this movie is a mutated iguana, but he looks more like an emaciated T-Rex. He, or she I guess, is also a scared and confused animal that just wants to hide and run away from humans so that she can lay her eggs. Definitely not the unstoppable god of destruction that Godzilla had been known for up to that point. Godzilla doesn't even have atomic breath in this movie. But the movie's fine in my opinion, honestly. It's not as bad as some fans would have you think, but it definitely was a massive departure from what fans were used to. I will say that the CGI and practical effects in this movie are actually really good. and hold up to this day. No one can deny that the scene with the fisherman on the dock is iconic now.
Hey! I got a bite!
The unfortunate side effect of this movie, however, is that it remains to this day, for many Americans, the one and only interpretation of Godzilla that they've ever seen. I know many older people who know nothing about Godzilla other than seeing this movie in the theaters back in 1998, and that's just a painful fact to have to reconcile with. A lot of people's only Godzilla movie was literally the worst movie in the entire franchise. But one good thing did come out of Godzilla 1998, and that was that it triggered Toho, the Japanese studio responsible for all the real Godzilla movies, to bring back the big G early and make a new authentic Japanese Godzilla movie, and that movie was Godzilla 2000. Godzilla 2000 was a direct response to the 1998 American Godzilla film. Toho felt like the movie had disrespected their character, and they weren't about to let America ruin their franchise like that. So they brought Godzilla back for another series of movies, now known as the Millennium era of films. These movies came out from 1999 to 2004, with Godzilla Final Wars being the last movie in the series, and the last Godzilla movie period for another decade until 2014, when America would have another crack at a Godzilla movie, this time with mild success and fan approval. The Millennium movies are often some of the most overlooked of the franchise, despite them having some of the best effects and suit designs of any of the movies so far. The Godzilla suit in Godzilla 2000 was pretty drastically redesigned from his appearance in the Heisei era movies. He sported large pinkish dorsal spines and a green skin tone for the first time. Yeah, that's right. Despite many people believing Godzilla has always had green skin, he actually had black skin for most of all the movies except for a few outliers. He also had red atomic breath, as opposed to his normal blue breath, which again, many people think Godzilla has always had red atomic breath, but actually it's been blue for most of the films. It's also not fire, for the record. It's more like a laser beam of plasma and radiation. But anyway, it's actually my favorite design for Godzilla out of all the movies, and I always used to play as Godzilla 2000 in the video games over his 90s counterpart. For some reason, I also used to think that the 90s Godzilla was a girl, while the Godzilla 2000 was a guy. I literally have no idea why I thought this, or why it mattered, but I just thought I'd mention it as a funny example of how kids like to invent stuff in their heads, and act like it's just a well-known fact. Maybe it had something to do with Godzilla 90's character model being slightly slimmed down compared to the 2000's character model. Or maybe it had something to do with the 1998 Godzilla movie, but I really couldn't tell you. Like I said earlier, I didn't watch any of the Heisei movies as a kid, so this was totally just something I made up in my head. The Millennium era would come to an end in 2004 with the release of Godzilla Final Wars. This was intended to be the last Godzilla movie ever, but as history shows, that plan never really pans out. It was, however, the last Godzilla movie for about a decade. This became known by fans as the Godzilla Dark Ages. It's also when I lost interest in Godzilla for quite a while. I was going into middle school and later high school, and I just thought I was too old for Godzilla stuff anymore. I also adopted the mindset that Godzilla movies were just objectively bad films, aside from the original, because they were low budget. Thankfully, though, I'd grow out of this mindset, and I'd return to Godzilla later in my college years. I'd sit down and dedicate myself to watching every movie in the franchise up to that point, and it rekindled my love and fascination for Godzilla. I embraced the cheesy, low-budget nature of many of the films, and I also recognized the deeper meaning and messaging hidden within many of the films, even the more goofy ones. I think the biggest influence on me going back to Godzilla was James Rolfe, or as many know him as the Angry Video Game Nerd. His retrospective episodes on the entire Godzilla franchise helped me to realize that the movies don't have to be high-budget Hollywood spectacle to be enjoyable or fun to watch.
It was in 1954, just less than a decade after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II.
Movies don't have to be the utmost of quality. What you like and what you don't like is purely subjective at the end of the day. And not every movie is attempting to be the next Godfather or Citizen Kane. You can watch a cheesy Godzilla movie and just embrace it for what it is and have fun with it. This realization led me to watch a lot of movies that I otherwise would have just overlooked, not just Godzilla movies. I went back and watched the original King Kong from 1933. I watched the classic Universal monster movies like Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Wolfman. I took a class at my college about foreign cinema, and it really opened my eyes to different ways movies can be made. Hollywood is simply a formula, and it isn't the only formula out there. Movies don't have to have a linear story, they don't have to have a happy ending, and they don't even really have to have a plot. A movie can be whatever the artist behind it wants it to be. That shift in perspective allowed me to enjoy the Godzilla movies in a way that I hadn't before. They weren't just goofy monster movies where guys in rubber suits punched each other. They were genuine works of art created on a minuscule budget that still managed to capture the attention of the entire world for decades. If that's not success, I don't know what is. Eventually, Godzilla would awaken from his slumber once again, and in 2014, we'd finally get a brand new Godzilla movie. It was another American movie, this time published by Legendary Pictures, and overall, it worked. It was a far cry from the abomination that was Godzilla 1998, and the movie had genuine emotion, modern CG spectacle, and even set up an entirely new franchise of movies that would come to be known as the Monsterverse, which is still going to this day. These movies brought in a lot of new fans into the franchise, and also brought back people who grew up with Godzilla but had forgotten about him over the years. Toho would also respond to this new era of American-made Godzilla movies with their own movie, Shin Godzilla, in 2016. Shin Godzilla was a complete reimagining of Godzilla. His design saw the most drastic redesign ever. Godzilla was now an evolving creature that changed form as the movie progressed. He started off as a larva-like creature, and then eventually took on a more recognizable, yet horrifying appearance. This Godzilla, as mentioned earlier, was meant to symbolize the Fukushima disaster caused by a devastating tsunami that destroyed most of the coast of Japan and sent the Fukushima nuclear plant into a full meltdown, a disaster that's still being handled and monitored to this day. Both the Monsterverse movies, as well as Shin Godzilla and the later movie Godzilla -1, have been collectively called the Reiwa era, which is the current and most modern era of Godzilla movies to date. In 2024, we got Godzilla Kong: The New Empire, and also Godzilla -1, which many fans consider to be the greatest Godzilla movie since the original. And we also got a TV show, Monarch: Legacy of Monsters, which takes place within the Monsterverse. It's definitely a good time to be a Godzilla fan right now. The franchise has never been healthier, and there's more to come on the horizon. So what is it that keeps the Godzilla franchise going? Why do so many fans keep coming back for more? And why do I love Godzilla? Well, I think it's a combination of a lot of different factors. For one, I grew up with Godzilla from a pretty young age. I don't even remember the first Godzilla movie I ever watched, because I was probably so young I can't remember, so nostalgia definitely plays a big role. But if nostalgia was the only thing, then there wouldn't be so many new fans, and there wouldn't be such a massive amount of interest in Godzilla so many years after the classic movies ended. I think Godzilla is a character that can adapt to any situation. He can be an allegory for nuclear war, he can be a protector and a hero for children, he can be a message against pollution or climate change, he can even mirror the devastation of a natural disaster. Godzilla is a versatile and adaptive character that never loses touch with the times. Godzilla is also a fascinating creature. He's at times a tragic monster created from the mistakes of humanity, but he's also a hero, or a force of nature. Godzilla always feels fresh and new no matter how many times he's on the big screen. His movies range in tone from super serious war dramas to goofy anti-hero action movies. I don't think we'll ever grow tired of Godzilla, because no matter what the world needs from him, Godzilla will rise to the challenge. Just like Godzilla himself, the Godzilla franchise is an unstoppable force that will continue to live on for many years into the future, and I guess that's why me and so many people love Godzilla. Thanks for watching all the way through to the end of this video. If you guys liked it, make sure you like the video and subscribe, and I'll be making more content like this in the near future. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.